Hello, everyone. On behalf of JDI and myself, I'd like to welcome you all to this evening's webinar. A special hello and welcome to our brilliant speakers this evening, Derek Penzler and Adam Mendelsohn. Derek is the William Lee Frost Professor of Jewish History at Harvard University. He has previously taught at Indiana University, the University of Toronto, and Oxford University, where he was the inaugural holder of the Stanley Lewis Chair in Israel Studies. He takes a comprehensive and transnational approach to Jewish history, which he studies within the context of modern capitalism, nationalism, and colonialism. Adam Mendelsohn is the director of the Kaplan Center for Jewish Studies, an associate professor of history at the University of Cape Town, and the co-editor of the Journal of American Jewish History. He was curator and chief historian of the exhibition, The First Jewish Americans, at the New York Historical Society, and co-curator of By Dawn's Early Light at the Princeton University Museum of Art. My name is Ashley Fishoff. I sit on the steering committee for the JDI, and I will be moderating this exciting event. The structure of this evening will be as follows. After my introduction, I will ask both speakers a series of questions and give them 5 minutes to respond to each question. After this, I will open the floor to questions from the audience. If you have any questions at any point during the presentation, please post them in the chat room, and we will do our very best to address as many questions as possible in the question and answer session at the end. We are going to be muting everyone, so if you need to be unmuted, please feel free to raise your hand. For the purpose of time, please try to keep your questions brief. I also want to take this opportunity to remind everyone that JDI is only able to put on these brilliant events through membership fees and donations. So if you would like to sign up or renew your membership, you can find the details in the chat room below. Tonight's webinar is an opportunity for us to engage more deeply with the newly developed definition of anti-Semitism by the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism, the JDA. As a response to the IHRA definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the JDA definition defines anti-Semitism as discrimination, prejudice, hostility, or violence against Jews as Jews, or Jewish institutions as Jewish. JDA critiques the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism as being too broad and too vague, placing disproportionate attention on one arena, Israel-Palestine. Through providing a clearer definition and coherent set of guidelines, the JDA definition of anti-Semitism seeks to, and I quote, 1, strengthen the fight against anti-Semitism by clarifying what it is and how it is manifested, and 2, to protect a space for an open debate about the vexed question of the future of Israel-Palestine, end quote. With the support of over 200 academics, the JDA definition challenges the very foundation on which the IHRA definition rests, that of equating anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism, and as such intertwining Jewish and Zionist identities. As the IHRA definition continues to gain traction globally, public discourse has been dominated by this narrative, with significant consequences for Jewry and social activists globally. Since its inception on an international scale, the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism has been weaponized to stifle critique of the Israeli regime. The consequences of the IHRA definition have also been felt within Jewish communities across the diaspora, with external perceptions of Zionism and Judaism influencing how Jews grapple with their Jewish and Zionist identities, or lack thereof, in their everyday lives. This is evident in South Africa, as despite no South African institution or governing body formally adopting the IHRA definition, its de facto application has been felt in community responses to external critique of Israel-Palestine, as well as community responses to those who critique and challenge the Israeli regime from within the Jewish community. The JDA definition, an alternative to the IHRA definition, conceptualizes of anti-Semitism through a historical lens, linking the fight to combat anti-Semitism with anti-racist movements and struggles for freedom. Rather than a weapon to disregard any and all critique of the Israeli regime, the JDA definition serves as a tool to protect freedom of expression. The JDA definition disrupts dominant discourses, redirecting the struggle against anti-Semitism to focus on what it ought to be fighting for: the protection of Jewish lives, bodies, and customs. Tonight's discussion will look more deeply at the need for a coherent definition of anti-Semitism, the specifics of the new JDA definition, and its significance in a South African context. Without further ado, my first question is for you, Derek. The IHRA definition has been around for over a decade now, though in the past few years, it has amassed more and more attention as a result of its application to groups and individuals who criticize Israel. What was the underlying need for the JDA? In other words, what exactly is wrong with the IHRA definition? And why has it taken so long for an appropriate alternative to the IHRA to be conceived? Let's see, Gabby, can you please unmute Derek?
There we go. Thank you. Thank you, Ashley. Thank you for the question. Thank you for hosting this event. Well, first, I think first thing I want to say is it's not like the IHRA is terrible and has nothing good about it. And I just want to explain the context. I mean, in the early 21st century, Jewish organizations throughout the world, including the IHRA, were dealing with a real problem, which was increasing anti-Semitism, increasing acts of violence against Jews, and verbal attacks and physical attacks against Jews and Jewish property and so on. And there was a need to sort of understand what was going on and to define it and to keep track of it. And so, I think some well-meaning people thrashed out a definition, which was called a working definition. A working definition means a work in progress. And they came up with the wording that they did. Now, keep in mind that although the conversation goes back really into the early 21st century, the document was not, formally adopted by the IHRA, I think until 2015 or so, 2015, 2016. And so we're actually talking about something fairly recent. And the JDA itself, and again, I wasn't one of the authors of the JDA, although I was an early supporter of it, those conversations go back well over a year. So it's actually, it isn't like this was sitting around festering for years and years and years and nobody was doing anything about it. So we're really talking about a continuity. The second thing is there are aspects of the IHRA that are okay. There are other aspects that aren't. And I can just speak very briefly from personal experience from a very concrete issue, which is that in addition to being a faculty member, I do work with the court system in Canada. I've worked on one case that's now on appeal in Ontario, another case in a different province that I can't speak about. But I deal with people who are being accused of forms of hate speech. Anti-Semitism is considered hate speech in Canada, and it can be prosecuted. It's actionable, unlike in the United States. And I don't know about South Africa. But, and it's helpful to have a definition, to be able to call upon, not a legally binding definition, but some kind of definition that people can look to and say, okay, hundreds of scholars around the world agree this is anti-Semitism. And the IHRA has certain aspects that are useful, but then it goes off the rails at very key points. One is, as you mentioned, is it is extremely vague at the beginning when it speaks about a certain feeling or perception of Jews, and what does that mean? Then it can be overly rigid. It defines anti-Semitism as hatred, which is ironic because in that way, there's a lot of negative feelings about Jews that are anti-Semitic that fall short of hatred. There can be all sorts of feelings of resentment or various forms of animosity that fall short of, I don't know, like violent hatred or something. And the JDA does a much better job with that, of talking about the whole range of negative emotions that can be anti-Semitic. But then, yes, the IHRA says a number of things involving Israel. And it's not that the JDA doesn't focus on Israel as well. There's a lot in both of them about Israel, because this is the really controversial issue right now, is to what extent conversation about Israel crosses the line into anti-Semitism. And what the IHRA does, and I cannot divine the interpretation or the mentality of the original authors, who knows what they were thinking, but it is either quite vague or ambiguous or misleading, I think, on a number of key points. And what the JDA does, and I think with great clarity and logic, except one, nobody who signed the JDA was happy with the whole thing. There was one sentence in the declaration I wasn't happy with, but I think all in all, it's just a much clearer document in telling us there are times when people can talk about Israel in a certain way that is probably anti-Semitic, and many times when it's not. And what I find so ironic about both supporters of the JDA and defenders of the IHRA is that they are ignoring the fact that most of the JDA document is about what anti-Semitism is. It is 10 of the 15 paragraphs, as it were, about what it is, and only 5 are about what it is not. So it really is still very much a document expressing concern for anti-Semitism, worry. It is not minimizing anti-Semitism, but it is saying the state of Israel is a real entity engaging in real actions, and people have a right to speak about what they see, including, by the way, being wrong. Freedom of speech means the right to be wrong, as long as you don't cross certain lines into overt hatred. And what the JDA really is trying to do is put that conversation about Israel into a realistic perspective. It would be much easier for me, certainly in the work I've done with the courts, the work I do as a teacher, the work I do as a researcher, to be able to say, look, we understand that anti-Semitism consists of A, B, and C, but there are times where people say very negative, critical, even hostile things about Israel, but this is not necessarily anti-Semitic. It would be very helpful when I'm trying to make a case that a certain person saying certain things is anti-Semitic, to not have to then constantly worry that what they're saying about Israel, well, maybe that isn't anti-Semitic, or maybe it is, or whatever. So I've just found that the JDA offers much greater clarity. And that's why I supported it right from the very beginning.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you, Derek. My next question is for you, Adam. The JDA has over 200 signatories, all of whom are distinguished academics in Jewish studies and related fields. Why do you think a formal definition of anti-Semitism is necessary? And do you feel the JDA definition has done a good job in defining something as broad, contextually specific, and emotive as anti-Semitism? And can someone please unmute Adam?
Thank you, Ashley, and thank you to the organizers of this event. So, why the need for a formal definition? Well, definition can serve a whole variety of purposes. It draws attention to a problem. So in other words, a public education role, raising awareness of an issue. In other words, a variety of benefits with an external focus. So drawing it can also have internal benefit. Again, something which Derek alluded to, that we all know the intensity of intracommunal fights over a variety of subjects, but often over Israel. And I think that one of the ways that the JDA is useful and for the Jewish community can be that it can help us think through the problems and negotiate the issues. And again, sort of an internal education role and a guide to what is acceptable and what is unacceptable, and an explanation of boundaries. So in other words, an explanatory tool. And as I said, I think particularly in the South African context, this is something which the JDA can do very well. Again, as Derek has suggested, the JDA and a definition more broadly can provide legal parameters and guidance. And again, there is here an interesting need in the South African context. Those of you who remember the Masuku case, which seemingly is sort of endlessly dragged on since 2009, the most recent, still it's waiting final judgment at the Constitutional Court, but the Supreme Court of Appeal, when it heard this case, the judgment has something interesting to say about the definitions which were presented by expert witnesses. And to actually quote the judgment, it said that the academic guidance was of minimal assistance with understanding the issues at stake. And I think, again, that would be an instance where the JDA is actually much more useful than the IHRA definition, particularly, again, because the Masuku case, so much of it is about what is acceptable to say about Israel and what is not, and what is acceptable to say about Zionists and what is not. And I think that's where, again, the JDA is much, much stronger than the IHRA definition. Likewise, what other benefits does a proper definition offer? It provides a mechanism for training to recognize a problem and to counteract it. So again, here, there are a variety of governments which have recognized the IHRA definition, the number of institutions which have used the IHRA definition as well, that again, to train the police, for example, to understand what is anti-Semitic and what is not. So getting it right does matter in a variety of ways. And again, particularly in a context like South Africa, where again, much of what is accused of being anti-Semitism, at least some of what is accused of being anti-Semitism, revolves around Israel. Getting this right is consequential. Another benefit of getting the definition right is that it provides, as Derek has described, a standard for measurement, for data collection. And in fact, here I can speak from direct experience that the Kaplan Center at the University of Cape Town, we've recently started a project aimed at trying to understand and to track anti-Semitism and racism on social media, so particularly on Twitter and Facebook. We have a team of researchers who are working on this, of annotators who are working on this, and we had this very question: how do we need to measure properly? And here again, the JDA definition was much more effective actually than the IHRA definition in terms of again teaching our annotators, none of whom are Jewish, to think about what crosses lines and what does not. Likewise, and another use of getting a definition right is that it can affect policy change. And it can, again, I suppose in some cases, this is why the data is being collected in the first place, is to understand obviously the scale of the problem, the nature of the problem, and then design interventions. And a definition can do a lot of good. And in fact, I see Tully Nates on the call, and we were talking about this the other day, and she raised a very good point, which I'll repeat to you, which is that she's described how IHRA recently, just a few months ago, came up with a definition on anti-Romaism or anti-Gypsyism, and how important that is in a European context where the Roma are actively discriminated against in a whole variety of ways. So it does all these things that I've spoken about, that it draws attention to the problem, it can affect policy change, it can provide legal parameters, all these sorts of things. So legal definitions, getting definitions right, it can have all sorts of great benefits. But obviously the flip side of this, and the reason we're participating in a conversation like this evening, is that definitions can be very useful, but also they can be problematic when they're proscriptive in a politically fraught terrain like the Israel-Palestine conflict in particular. They can be used, as many of you know, to chill speech. They can be wielded as a weapon. They can be instrumentalized in a variety of ways. And this clearly is what was behind the need to come up with the JDA definition, is that particularly in an American context, that the IHRA definition in a variety of ways was being, or the demonstration that it was being wielded as a weapon and used often as a threat. And so hence coming up with something which is more nuanced, which is more sophisticated, is necessary. I think the South African example, South African case is very different from the American case. There isn't, as again, Ashley, I think you alluded to, that same institutional traction, at least outside the Jewish community when it comes to the IHRA definition. But still, I think that the JDA definition is very, very useful, particularly for that role which I suggested, which is an educational role within the Jewish community, in a way of, again, of setting parameters, setting the terms of the conversation within the Jewish community about what is speech which you might not like, but is certainly is not anti-Semitic speech.
Sorry to interrupt, Adam. This is very important, and we will be coming back to the South African context very soon. Thank you. Okay, Derek, my next question is for you. Obviously, the issue of Israel is at the center of the debate around the IHRA definition. In a time of growing use and misuse of identity politics, the conflation between Zionism and Judaism is being made by both Jews who wish to silence legitimate criticism of Israel and alleged anti-Semites who wish to hold all Jews responsible for the actions of the Israeli regime, especially in the occupied Palestinian territories. How do you respond to this claim? And how does the JDA do a better job at defining anti-Semitism, differentiating it from anti-Zionism, and defending people's rights to freedom of expression in relation to the state of Israel? And can someone please unmute Derek?
There we go, thanks. Well, I think there's two slightly different questions. So I'll start actually with the latter part. One of the problems with the IHRA is that there's a very strange sentence early on where it says that criticism of Israel, like criticism of any other country, is fine. Well, what does that mean? I mean, really think about this. Because after all, there are now lots of people in the United States who say that the United States is structurally racist. That's a kind of standard academic critique of the United States, and one can find that also among the progressive left outside of academia and journalism and in the Black Lives Matter movement and lots of other places. It's not unusual. So does that mean that one could say Israel is structurally racist because people are making those criticisms of the US? Well, a lot of defenders of the IHRA definition would say, no, you can't say those sorts of things. In other words, if really people can make criticisms of Israel that are like criticisms make of any other country, people could say anything about Israel. I mean, I live in Canada, a country where people talk about dividing the country and having a separate Quebecois nation state. That's considered legal in Canada. You can say these things. So there's a problem here. That on the face of it, the JDA seems to say, oh no, you can pretty much say, sorry, the IHRA says you can say whatever you want. Well, no, actually the way people are interpreting it, at least, and as well as two of the three authors of it, they're saying, no, you couldn't say that. Also, later on in the IHRA, it says that it's considered anti-Semitic to say that Zionism is racist. Well, you know, again, I don't believe that Zionism is inherently racist. I don't really believe that at all. But if somebody wants to say that, is that wrong? I mean, do they not have the right to say it? For example, I don't believe that everything about the United States is permeated with racism and nothing but, although I do think there's structural racism in the US. Am I not allowed to say that? Well, of course I am. So in other words, the problem with the IHRA is that it, on one hand, seems to offer freedom of expression, but then it takes it away. And that's the problem. Similarly, on the issue of boycotts. I mean, if people want to boycott a country, not buy its products and tell their friends not to buy its products or to impose sanctions or whatever, people have this right. Why is it in the case of Israel shouldn't be allowed to have this right? So the IHRA is very funny this way, in that it seems to extend these freedoms, but then it takes them away. What the JADA does, which I think is much more effective, is it says that, of course, in and of itself, you can say these things and you can engage in these practices. That's not what is in and of itself anti-Semitic. What's anti-Semitic is when it gets tied up with certain ways of thinking and speaking about Jews, conspiratorial and demonization, and combined with incitement to violence and so forth. So the JDA is simply much more precise. So what the JDA is trying to do is provide for greater freedom of expression. But again, I want to emphasize, because I think that in a way we're accepting the language of the JDA's own critics, that the JDA in and of itself is very much about what anti-Semitism is, and not only what it is not. And I don't know about the South African context, but it sounds like from what Adam was just saying, it might actually be helpful in situations where there's a lot of hostility towards Israel in public discourse, and where people are saying, well, no, because you can talk about Israel and it's not necessarily anti-Semitic. No, you could say, no, there are times when you're talking about Israel in ways that are anti-Semitic. And now I'll just briefly answer the question about dual loyalty issues and attachment to Israel and making Jews responsible for everything Israel does. This is a very tricky issue. The IHRA definition doesn't handle it well. The JDA definition handles it somewhat better through subtle changes in wording, but we still have a problem, which is that most Jews in the world are attached to Israel. Most Jews in the world have some attachment, emotional, political, you name it, to Israel. Some don't. Some want nothing to do with Israel, but most Jews have some attachment. So to what extent are Jews in diaspora responsible for those things that the state of Israel does that people find objectionable? You might say, well, they're not. They don't live in the country. They don't vote. Well, what if they give money to various institutions that support settlements in the West Bank? What if they actually do support the current government of the state of Israel? Are they then responsible? And that's really a very tough question. So I think what the JDA is trying to do is saying that just because Jews are Jews does not mean that they can be associated with, let's say, support for the Israeli government. But what if they do support the Israeli government? I mean, there's lots of Jews in Toronto who think that the Netanyahu regime is wonderful. Okay. So is it anti-Semitic to say that such people support an immoral set of policies or a racist set of policies? I don't think it's necessarily anti-Semitic to say that. So even the JDA is still struggling with this issue. It's very, very hard to find the correct language, because the fact is that many Jews in the world, if not most, and I think it is most, are attached to Israel in one form or another. That is not the same thing as being treacherous or dual loyalty or anything like that. It's a sense of emotional connection. And the JDA has not quite figured that one out. I think it would be very, very hard to do in a short document.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Derek. Thank you. Adam, the next question is for you. The IHRA definition has not been formally adopted by any of our Jewish communal institutions or by our government in South Africa. However, in many ways, it seems that it has been applied de facto in the way that our community addresses criticism of Israel. For example, in the past, when JDI has sought to present Israeli activists and organizations who actively oppose the occupation, we have been accused of being anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic, and self-hating Jews. Could you comment on this and speak to how the adoption of the JDA by communal organizations could better protect those South African Jews who legitimately oppose the policies of the Israeli government from ostracization on the basis of being anti-Semitic?
Good question there, thank you. So you're absolutely right that the IHRA definition, at least officially, has not had traction outside the Jewish community, and certainly within the Jewish community, it formally has not been adopted by organizations, but you see elements of similar thinking, particularly when it comes to how IHRA deals with Israel-Palestine matters. So in other words, de facto application, as you described it. And certainly I did notice that there was an event relatively recently organized by the South African Zionist Federation just a few months ago, not, I think, accidentally coinciding with, at least my assumption is that it was organized after the JDA definition declaration was made. And again, I read the language that they used in the ad quite carefully, and they're making the argument for why the IHRA definition is the obvious definition to use in a South African context. As I suggested earlier, I think the reason why JDA is useful is it serves can serve a variety of different purposes, but one is this intracommunal education that's explaining the terms of debate, or at least defining the terms of debate that much better. I do, though, however, think that it's unrealistic to expect, given the nature of the South African Jewish community, I don't think JDA is going to be adopted widely, or perhaps might not be adopted by any organizations other than perhaps by the JDI. I think again it's useful as a tool. It's useful as a means of pushing back and trying to explain to people why, how and why organizations like JDI approach Israel and in particular ways. Likewise, I think it can be used to make arguments against the accusation of anti-Semitism within the Jews. That JDI, just to make an example, that JDI would be accused of anti-Semitism. But again, I think that this is we know that Israel matters within the Jewish community are often a sort of a bare knuckle brawl, and it's not, rational arguments don't necessarily win out. But I think you can, again, it's useful as a principled case that you can, it's, as I said, useful as an explanatory tool. This explains our thinking. This explains what we regard as acceptable and as unacceptable. Again, whether it'll be successful or not is unclear. But speaking rationally here, or speaking as an observer of the Jewish community, I would like the JDA to certainly enter into the broader discourse within the South African Jewish community. But realistically, I don't think we're going to see a variety of organizations which are going to jump on it and say that this is going to shape our thinking. So at the same time, I think that there are elements which might be drawn from it without it explicitly being referenced. Because I think, again, that amongst a number of parties, there is recognition that the IHRA definition is crude or not particularly helpful in a South African context when it comes to Israel-Palestine, and that the JDA again is better suited in terms of South Africa. Again, and here I'm thinking as well of how elements within the Jewish community interact with BDS, how the Jewish community responds to a whole variety of incidents which most people on the call are very familiar with, where the Chief Justice says something which is then where he's accused of being in the pocket of the Israel lobby, or alternatively when candidates for judgeships are asked very pointed, difficult, and perhaps offensive questions at the Judicial Services Commission. Again, that's where the JDA is actually useful, because it offers ways to explain both to the community, the Jewish community, but also to the broader public, why things are potentially offensive, or perhaps why they're offensive, but are still free speech. They might not be anti-Semitism.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Adam. I just want to remind everyone that if you have any questions, please post them in the chat room. I will now be asking Derek and Adam the two final questions, and we will then move on to a question and answer session. So my next question is for you, Derek. The JDA appears to be a comprehensive approach to the fight against anti-Semitism and hatred in general, and a tool to be used either as a supplement or an alternative to the IHRA definition. Now that we have this tool at our disposal, how do we use it to fight anti-Semitism and prevent false claims of anti-Semitism if it claims to be a non-legally binding definition? And in addition, how do we encourage more individuals, organizations, institutions, and governments to adopt it as a working definition? So a dynamic definition that adapts and speaks to the more accurate needs of our time.
Well, it's a good question, because even the IHRA definition says right at the very beginning, it is a non-legally binding statement. And as I've recently written, I think of the JDA as decentering IHRA, but not replacing it. And I think I've defined it as a thinking tool and not a policy document. And what I think the JDA is already beginning to accomplish what it's set out to do, which is it's not seeking to become a new Torah Misinai. It's seeking to become a document that will make people aware that there aren't simple answers to this question, and that ultimately what I would like to see, and I'm most familiar with the university world, you know, the people who supported the JDA come from, a lot of them are academics, most of them are academics. And what I would like universities to do is they have to think for themselves. I mean, what I would like them to do is be aware of the IHRA, be aware of the JDA. There's another document called the Nexus document. For them to look at these documents and think, and this gets back to Adam's comment about context, you know, in the context of Canada or of South Africa or of the United Kingdom or wherever, what kind of issues are being dealt with in these definitions that are applicable or not applicable? In other words, I'm asking for something that might be quite demanding, which is that people need to think for themselves. It's much easier to just adopt something from the outside and say, okay, we've taken care of the problem. But that's not sufficient. And I think that this is actually already beginning to happen. And I can give you a couple of examples. One is that 5 or 6 American congressional representatives have become aware of the JDA and either have written to or are about to write to the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, making him aware of the JDA and the Nexus documents presence and say, you know, we need to keep this in mind when we move forward. The second is that I was surprised that mainstream American Jewish organizations did not react to the JDA when it first came out. And someone said, well, it's because the JDA is so inconsequential that they're not even bothering. You'll know that it's beginning to make an impact when they react. Well, just a couple of days ago, the American Jewish Committee and the Anti-Defamation League both issued condemnations of the JDA in language that I thought was, although not intemperate, it was unfair. But the point is they're becoming aware of it. They're becoming aware that people are aware of the document. Some people are listening to it. And in that sense, I think it's beginning to work. It's beginning to have a positive effect. But ultimately, what I want to see the JDA do then is not to become a new document that will be somehow formally adopted by thousands of civil society, you know, institutions or NGOs, but that it will be a means by which these institutions can think for themselves and come up with their own standards of what is and is not considered acceptable speech. And again, that's much more difficult to do, but I think it's the honest thing to do. And given the very different contexts that we're dealing with throughout the world, it's the right thing to do.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you, Derek. Adam, this is the final question for you. As South African Jews, relative to many other Jewish communities around the world, where the IHRA definition has been adopted and is being used as the standard, we enjoy great freedom and safety. We can also acknowledge that there's a distinction between overt and covert forms of anti-Semitism. How then can a definition, whether it be the IHRA or JDA, respond to the contextual elements to differentiate between those incidents that are intentionally malicious forms of anti-Semitism and those examples that fit the bill of anti-Semitism, but result from ignorance and misinformation, often on the grounds of class and race, as is often the case in South Africa? And can we please unmute? There we go.
There you go. Got it. Good. These are. It's a good question, and again with 2 parts, which I'll again separate out. You make the point that Jews in South Africa live in a great freedom and safety, and certainly in terms of anti-Semitic incidents, this is true. That the Board of Deputies keeps careful records on this. David Sachs is responsible for reporting this on an annual basis, and I've seen their data. They do a very good job of keeping track of really physical manifestations of anti-Semitism. So certainly assault, but also then a whole variety of other things too. Verbal incidents, daubing of anti-Semitic of swastikas on buildings, those sort of things. And certainly, as you pointed out, in South Africa, our data is pretty good compared with, it's actually very good compared with other countries. And it's not just because there are relatively few Jews in South Africa, a community now of perhaps 52,000. It's the whole variety of other factors at work there. The Kaplan Center did a study now in 2016, which looked at the attitudes of Black South Africans towards Jews, and again, Jews for the most part don't feature in terms of the average person's thinking about South Africa's problems, et cetera, et cetera. So South African Jews sort of benefit from a whole variety of factors there. At the same time, again, a Kaplan Center study, which we finished last year, this decennial survey of the South African Jewish population, found that South African Jews are actually very worried about anti-Semitism. And you see that particularly if you compare data from previous studies. So if you go back to the 1998 study, the 2005 study of the South African Jewish population, we see quite a significant escalation of concern in terms of worry about anti-Semitism. And it's not reflected in terms of physical attacks. As I said, the data collected by the Board of Deputies is relatively stable on that. Instead, I think what South African Jews are encountering is a fair amount of uncomfortable and sometimes directly anti-Semitic discourse online. And I think sort of social media plays a very interesting role in this, hence the fact that we now have a social media project focused on exactly this question. So I think that, and there we don't have a very clear grasp of that. In other words, we don't really know of how extensive anti-Semitism is in terms of social media in South Africa. Certainly what we've already found some signs of is that there is direct drawing from sort of white supremacist discourse in the United States, which is reflected on social media in South Africa. There's that element, but at the same time, there's something else which is very interesting, which there's a good op-ed written by Jonathan Jansen very recently in the Sunday Times, who made this point that South Africans reference Hitler frequently, and that Hitler appears in political discourse on university campuses far out of proportion to what you might expect. So there's again, there might be something going on here, beyond the physical threat or absence of physical threat, seemingly that South African Jews face. So that's as a lengthy prelude to answering your core question, which again is about how can this definition be useful, and particularly in a South African context. And I think we've alluded to most of the ways it can already, in terms of informing, communal discussion, in terms of potentially informing broader societal conversation about anti-Semitism and about what is acceptable, what is unacceptable as well. And I think these educational roles are crucial. And here, particularly what I think the JDA does well is this tripartite definition or breakdown and the examples that it provides. Both describing what is unacceptable, what clearly is anti-Semitic, and then these other categories which are either not anti-Semitic or can be in a way anti-Semitic as well. And your question in part was about intent. Intent certainly matters, that people say things which may be anti-Semitic or not. But again, I suppose it's also a question of how they are perceived as well. So I think it's helpful, can be helpful in a whole variety of ways. Explaining what is clearly anti-Semitic, explaining what may be anti-Semitic, and explaining what is not anti-Semitic. And again, explaining to those who are potentially ignorant about why what they've said and why the tropes that they might be dealing with are offensive. And again, I think that one of the things that I'm struck by from our the Kaplan Center's prior work is that people are very ignorant about Jews, know very little about Jews, but I think that there's also I suspect is openness for the most part to learning as well. That's one of the advantages of Jews being this relatively unknown category for many South Africans, is that I would hope that when you present people with an explanation which says that this is what you said here is likely to be offensive, and this is why, that we might be able to actually educate people, and you might actually be able to, again, in a more gentle way, push back against a discourse which is very unpleasant.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Adam. I'm seeing the questions in the chat box. Thank you so much, everyone. And we will try our best to answer as many as possible in our time frame. So Derek and Andrew have asked questions in a similar field. So I'm going to ask Raymond's, then ask Andrew's, and then Derek and Adam will both have a chance to respond. So Raymond says, Derek and Adam, to what extent do you think JDA and its thinking will get traction globally? And to what extent and where do you see signs of it? Why do you think it won't get traction in South Africa? What is provocative about it or difficult to accept? And building from this, Andrew asks Adam, you say that the JDA is unlikely to be adopted by any South African Jewish institutions other than the JDI, that you doubt the South African Jewish community, is unlikely to support the JDA readily, but that you think it would be useful for the JDA to be discussed within the South African Jewish community for educational purposes. How likely do you think it is that by having the JDA circulated for discussion will not put it into competition with the older IHRA definition and will drive wedges between South African Jews, especially about Israel? So I think, Derek, you are open to answering, and then we will go to Adam. And there we go.
I just want to respond very briefly before I answer the question, picking up on Adam's last point about, that yes, people perceive anti-Semitism. On the one hand, I agree, Adam, we have to be aware how people perceive things so that we can talk to them and educate them and communicate with them and so on. On the other hand, something like 70% of American Republicans perceive widespread voting fraud in the 2020 election, and there wasn't widespread voting fraud. And because they perceive it, they are now trying to basically destroy the American democratic system by making it impossible for people to vote. So yes, they perceive something, but just because people perceive something doesn't mean it's there. Now, I do believe that the anti-Semitism is real. There's a lot more anti-Semitism in the world today than there was voting fraud in the 2020 election. But there's a difference between recognizing perception and then simply letting those people's perceptions dictate the conversation. So I mentioned briefly about some change in the United States that suggests that the JDA might be getting some traction. Ironically, it might be the countries that have had the greater problems with anti-Semitism that might be less willing to adopt the JDA because the IHRA is at work, gives them a cover. So in the United Kingdom, it's very convenient for universities that have been accused of tolerating anti-Semitism to simply say, well, we've adopted the IHRA definition. We're virtuous, we're off the hook. Something similar in Canada, where our universities in general have probably had more in the way of pro-Palestinian sentiment than in the United States. So it might be a little harder. Also, the Jewish community, yes, it's true that the Jewish communities tend to be more pro-IHRA than pro-JDA. But in the United States, there's J Street. Now, J Street doesn't have the kind of impact that AIPAC has, but it's growing, and it gets a hearing on in Washington. Whereas in Canada, the Jewish community is much smaller, it's politically weaker, and it's probably a lot harder. Now, there is a progressive, wing in the Canadian Jewish community, but it's going to be harder, and it's going to be harder in the United Kingdom. So I think global traction really depends on a lot of factors. And then as far as, what is it that's so hard to accept about the JDA? This is really fascinating. I'm a historian. My job is to write the history of countries. And I write about Israel the way I would write about Russia or China or any other country, which, countries do bad things. They just do. They also do good things, and they inspire people. And, so I feel in a way like I haven't been vaccinated against COVID, which I wish I had been. If I'd been in the States, I'd be vaccinated by now. But Canada, we're having some problems. But I feel like I've been vaccinated against this paranoia against simply speaking the truth. That is, there is a very deep-seated feeling among people who are attached to any cause, any national cause for sure, to deny the misdeeds of the people with whom they associate. And I've written about the 3 stages of denial. Simply put, it didn't happen, it wasn't that bad, and we had no choice. And I feel like the established Jewish communities dealing with Israel-Palestine are stuck in various stages of denial. Nakba didn't happen, it wasn't what the Palestinians say it was, and if it did happen, there was no choice. And it's very, very hard to accept the JDA's much calmer, more, I would say, distanced approach, which is that bad things happened, bad things continue to happen. This does not mean that the state of Israel, has no right to exist. This does not mean that the state of Israel should be, the language of the IHRA's defenders is, you're saying the state of Israel should be destroyed. No, a lot of people are not saying the state of Israel should be destroyed. They're just saying there are things happening in Israel that are undeniably, empirically real. Let's acknowledge it. Let's talk about it, and let's figure out ways to alter it. Now, the language with which those things are being discussed is not always as calm as the way I'm speaking now. It can be quite intemperate. It can be quite angry. I mean, I've been to plenty of pro-Palestinian events where the atmosphere has been heated. It's not to my taste, to be sure. I have felt very uncomfortable in such events. Not that I'm going to get killed or anything, but I feel uncomfortable. But they have a right to speak. That's all I'm saying. They have a right to say the things that they're saying. And it would be helpful if people in the Jewish community would recognize the reality underneath even the intemperate speech. But it's very, very difficult for people who are attached to a cause. And I taught at the University of Toronto for many years, where I had students from every beleaguered national community in the world. And the one thing they could all agree on, I teach courses on comparative nationalism, the one thing they could agree on is that their people, whoever they were, had been historically oppressed, and it was somebody else's fault, right? They went through life with a litany of grievances against some other people, and they would never admit their own community's wrongdoing. So in this sense, I'm afraid the supporters of Israel are acting like everyone else. And this is why it is so difficult for many people to simply look at the JDA and say, okay, this is an intelligent way to move forward, which it is.
Thank you. Thank you, Derek. Very powerful. Adam, would you like to respond? Can we unmute Adam, please?
Okay, thanks. So I'll answer specifically the question about why do I think it's unlikely to be broadly adopted in a South African context. I think that for a whole variety of reasons. That one, I think the IHRA definition is useful for elements within some organizations within the Jewish community. It draws hard lines, and I think that in a number of cases it aligns with broader sentiment within parts of the Jewish community and some Jewish communal leaders as well. So I think that the hard lines it draws on BDS and alternative visions for Israel, again, it conforms with broader sentiments. That's actually it has traction in that sort of way, that even if it isn't formally adopted by common organizations, it's useful, it fits, and it's obviously very uncomfortable or undesirable in many cases to forsake something which seemingly has major credibility, international credibility, academic credibility, and instead to opt for something which is far more nuanced and difficult and which isn't so seemingly clear cut as the IHRA definition. I think another perhaps reason why the JDA will maybe not struggle, but certainly why it has a tough road ahead in a South African context is within some Jewish common organizations, is that I don't think necessarily there is universal commitment to open and free speech about this matter, about Israel-Palestine matters. That again, many South African Jews feel very, very strongly on this issue, and again, that the sense that IHRA provides, or the sentiment which it's mobilized support, that certain things are unacceptable, that certain things are anti-Semitic, again is comforting and provides support to a number of people's views. And so again, the JDA will have to battle against that, and again, the certainty which IHRA provides, and the seeming straightforward clarity which IHRA provides, and the ability for IHRA to be used as a weapon against internal critics or those who are perceived to be traitors within the Jewish community, or otherwise, JDA is much more complicated in that way. To Mugsy's question, or the issue that Mugsy raises about will it potentially create wedges within the Jewish community, I think those wedges are already there. I think the divisions are there, that between, and I think that the internal accusations about people being self-hating Jews, or people being traitors or otherwise, that's a reality which long predates JDA and will long continue after the JDA is accepted or rejected or discussed or not discussed. That certainly I think JDA can potentially be used, as I've suggested, to open up conversations, but I think that it's as I've suggested now several times, and I think that there's a very difficult road ahead for it in terms of broad acceptance. I think that again it can be used subtly, it can be used to raise questions within the community, but I think that a number of its points are likely to be unpopular realistically. Because it does open up the possibility of an acceptance that people will say things that you dislike, but it's not anti-Semitic. It's just opinion, and it might be offensive opinion, but to you, but it's still within the realm of what is acceptable.
Fantastic. I would like to take this opportunity to thank everyone for your time, for attending this brilliant event, and specifically to thank our speakers, Adam and Derek. This was very thought-provoking, and I think the start of an exciting and challenging conversation globally and specifically within the South African context. I want to apologize to everyone whose questions we didn't get the chance to address. And just a reminder about membership, that you can find the membership details in the chat room. I would like to offer our speakers a minute each just to give a closing statement before we finish the webinar. Derek.
I want to thank you all, and I just want to, in my 1 minute, I'll respond to one question I saw in the chat, which was, is it anti-Semitic to talk about Israel as a state of all of its citizens, or is there a confederation or something? And my answer is no. I mean, I remember, and during the first Intifada, when people first began to speak of a two-state option, it was widely decried as anti-Semitic. Anti-Semitic talk about a two-state option. And then by the mid-1990s, it had become conventional to support the two-state option. And now people are talking, particularly within Israel and outside of it, about various optional forms of sovereignty. And they're being decried as destructive of the Jewish state and as anti-Semitic. But we can see how contextual this all is. The fact is that Zionism and Israel have been contested from the very beginning. The country today doesn't have fixed borders. It's still a country in process, as it were. And I don't see anything anti-Semitic about having conversations about political forms of Israel-Palestine that might be conducive to greater peace and stability. Now, one could argue they won't work, but there's nothing inherently anti-Semitic about such conversations. And this, again, I think demonstrates the superiority of the JDA, which simply says flat out that this sort of conversation is not in and of itself anti-Semitic.
Thank you. Adam.
A very good summation from Derek, and I would urge those who are interested to read the very lively online debates, discussions going on around this, that there's a very interesting back and forth, again, with very strong opinions expressed by some of the participants in Fathom, an online journal, which Derek has contributed to, and a number of other very thoughtful, sometimes less thoughtful contributions around this too. But again, there's a sort of lively discussion, and I hope it is all productive. And I think that Derek has pointed to the ways in which, certainly in an American context, hopefully it is likely to lead to push back to more discussion, to a greater openness. And obviously, I would hope for the same in the South African context too. That when here, I think we in a way, some of this is even more necessary, both for the Jewish community and more broadly. And it's given the dynamics are so different from the US and even the UK in terms of how BDS operates and is thought of in the broader South African context, how Israel is thought about in the broader South African environment. It's again useful both for the Jewish community to think about these issues, but then also for greater clarity about what is acceptable and what is unacceptable in broader public discourse. So I think having these thoughtful conversations and thinking carefully and again, modifying definitions when necessary and coming up with alternatives is very, very productive. So again, I think that particularly, JDA will serve this, or can serve the South African Jewish community very, very well, and can serve South Africa well in terms of thinking through certain problems. So it's again something I'm delighted that has been, that it was initiated and has been publicized, and hopefully generate a positive change.
Thank you so much, Adam. A brilliant way to end this evening's webinar. Please feel free to contact us via email at info@jdisa.org and follow us on Facebook and Instagram so we can keep the conversation alive. Thank you so much for your time and engagements. Have a good evening. Bye.